Like most of us, all around the island of Ireland, and indeed beyond, I've been paying attention to the recent unrest, to put it mildly, in the north, and it really got me to think about something that I've been feeling into this past few years, and I found myself, in Ireland anyway, listening differently, like over these past few years, and it's just that the recent developments in the north has sort of just tuned me back into this conversation with myself, really, and the way, as I say, that I found myself listening differently to conversations about immigration in Ireland, in recent years. And it's not that immigration is new, but like, obviously the terrain has certainly shifted, and understandably the conversation has changed with it. Like, but what strikes me though is not so much the volume of disagreement, but the register in which it now takes place. I mean, like the tone feels altered altogether. Tighter, more compressed somehow. And at least in my experience, it's less recognisably Irish, Now, what do I mean by that? I feel it's less recognisably Irish, In my view, like, Ireland has always had a particular way of arguing and disagreeing. Now, at times it can be messy, and it's often direct and often quite sharp, and sometimes this can expose personal vulnerabilities, where the distinction between response and reaction can become fuzzy, let's say. Our tendency toward defensiveness here in Ireland has a rich, like, and in all fairness, not altogether unjustifiable history. But by and large, like, disagreement here has always remained relational, I feel. There's always been a conversational generosity in Ireland. And this generosity has allowed people to clash and yet still sit at the same table. A type of quintessentially Irish form of dark humour can almost always be counted on to release pressure before it builds too high, for all our personal peculiarities and tribal sensitivities, like this special brew of Celtic madness, if you will, which historically has pervaded the Irish mentality, has in the main been tempered by an innate sense of fairness, in my view, Now, but what seems to be changing here then is not that we disagree more, but the way in which we disagree. That there's something very different in the pulse, let's say, of how we encounter each other at the place where opposing narratives meet, what was once a threshold of opportunity, a place where we might see each other a wee bit clearer, has in certain ways and in certain situations become a point of tension, like a line drawn in the sand, a barrier that has begun to impede our capacity to relate in a way that opens outward toward connection and coherence, I'm not suggesting that this phenomenon is the new normal now. I don't think it is, thankfully. Far from it even. But I can't help but notice that our ability to hold conflicting perspectives, both in ourselves and each other, seems to be diminishing in certain ways. And as an ordinary Irish person, like, I have to confess, this unsettles me. It really does. Like, conversations that once wandered and were allowed to breathe, they now seem to restrict and retract more quickly, A remark, that might previously have opened a discussion now seems to close it, I mean, you can feel it in the air, like it's like a visceral tightening that reaches for resolution prematurely, I mean, the war in Ukraine, like, is a good example, like, but by no means the only one. When the issue, let's put it that way, when the issue of the Ukraine first, like, arrived on Irish shores, like, the conversation was animated and expansive. Like, now, to be sure, it was by no means devoid of controversy or mixed opinions, like, but it was alive and in full swing. Now, though, more often than not, any comment about Ukraine usually shifts very quickly to something else entirely. You know, it's like the whole, it's as if the whole storyline has undergone a kind of a curious transformation from practically wholesale acceptance and solidarity to one that feels more like quiet resignation and even muted resentment. That's how it feels to me anyway, you know. You know, on any given day, you could be directly there involved and you know, might be just simply overhearing in a coffee shop a conversation about housing or the cost of school books or the price of a weekly shop or something. And suddenly someone says, out of the blue, you know, they're bringing far too many of them in. And that's it, you know. The sentence is uttered like a stone being thrown across the room and lands like a fucking door slamming shut. Now, for me, you know, the issue isn't whether concerns are legitimate or grievances are valid, you know. At many, many real levels they are. The pressure regarding housing is very, very real. Public services are absolutely stretched, and there's no doubt now at all that the price of groceries feels like it's going through the fucking roof, you know. We all know that. And definitely this rapid, you know, the rapid demographic change in a small country will inevitably generate friction and raise temperatures. Like, so to pretend otherwise here would be naive and it'd be lazy. And more importantly, it'd be unfair. But what catches my attention instead is the compression. You know, that's to say, like, the speed with which complexity collapses into certainty. The way nuance seems to race out of the room at the first whiff of anything that might challenge our assumptions, you know. You know, at first, like, for myself, like, I try to account for this in political terms, you know. I thought to myself, you know, perhaps the centre in Ireland was shifting, and I suppose 'tis a bit, but, you know, or maybe economic strain was pushing people toward firmer ground, or, you know, perhaps we're simply catching up with these broader currents that have already been reshaping politics and social life elsewhere, certainly in mainland Europe and indeed the US, you know. And I think those explanations hold some weight, like, but when I paid attention more closely, anyway, for me, what I'm noticing is not primarily political or ideological, and this is what is hard to put words on. It feels tonal, you know, and as I say, I find that much harder to name. You know, because tone isn't about politics or policy, it's about cadence, you know. It's about how we enter into a conversation. It's whether a sentence invites further thought and engagement or recoils into detachment and apathy, you know. I mean, just like small children, like, tonal coherence requires that curiosity survives the first few exchanges, you know. You know, what also strikes me is that this tightening doesn't seem to locate itself in any particular point across the political spectrum either. You know, those who would consider themselves, let's say, centre-left, and those leaning more to the centre-right, or let's say conservative, as well as others who seem further out toward the respective peripheries. They all sound oddly familiar, you know, to me anyway. Now, not so much in the way they perceive things, but in how final and absolute these perceptions are expressed. So you know, slightly different stories, but exactly the same edge, you know. And look, you can be sure, like, I don't see myself outside of this phenomenon, let's put it like that. I'm not outside of it, you know. That there has been and continues to be plenty of moments when I catch myself wanting things to be simpler than they are, you know. Wanting a clean line through a tangled and complicated landscape. Feeling my own patience then, when someone else's view isn't aligning with mine. I often experience that subtle, you know, internal shift where, you know, listening gives way to bracing, you know. Like, it's so easy, isn't it? It's so easy to spot absolutism in someone else. Like, far harder, though, to notice when our own threshold of tolerance contracts and lowers by a few degrees, you know. And for me, lads, you know, that's not politics or ideology. It's human, you know. You know, when the ground feels less stable economically, socially, culturally, you know, we look for explanations that steady us. We want clarity. We want to know where things stand. Ambiguity becomes uncomfortable, and it can feel more like threat than what it is, just the complex texture of life happening, you know. In that sense, like what we're experiencing, may have less to do with some curious convergence of left and right, and more to do with something shared beneath both. I feel, like a type of restlessness or background hum, almost like, a sense that that things are moving in ways that can't be entirely accounted for it. And when you think about it, like the years during the COVID crisis probably sharpened that awareness for many of us, Not because that period explains all that much, I don't believe it does, but because it exposed how quickly institutional confidence can erode, For me, it made visible how much private and public life depends on trust, and how technical and managerial language can dominate when uncertainty accumulates, In that sense, I don't think that the COVID dilemma itself created the angst that certainly seemed to sweep through the land at that time, as much as it revealed the extent to which it may already have been there, quietly percolating beneath the surface. And when an indistinct, let's say, sense of unease begins to break water in the form of free-floating anxiety, unless it can find relational spaces to settle and ground, it will look for somewhere to land. And in recent years, immigration has become one such landing place. Not the only one for sure, but a very powerful one nonetheless. It concentrates questions about resources, identity, belonging and fairness, all in one place, Now again, this doesn't mean that people's concerns are imaginary, they're not. But sometimes the emotional charge is a fair bit larger than the situation requires, in my view. And this is what I've been struggling to put words on. It's not that Ireland has suddenly become extreme, It's just that finality, arrives faster. How could I put it? The move to certainty feels more immediate. Conversations close quicker where before they may have remained open, And look, of course, Ireland isn't unique in this, If anything, like we may be experiencing, I suppose, a somewhat milder version of something visible across, as I said earlier, much of Europe and the West more broadly. Societies negotiating economic strain, geopolitical uncertainty and cultural change simultaneously, all at the same time. But for me, Ireland does have certain habits, or at least it has had them, Like here earlier, I suggested that historically and culturally Ireland possesses a conversational suppleness, let's say, which is a core characteristic of what it feels to be Irish. As I said, we can be abrupt and sometimes quick to temper, but that fiery side of our historical and cultural inheritance has always been complemented by a reflex toward humour that has supported an imperfect yet robust sense of tolerance and fairness, in my view, And I think that this decidedly Irish temperament has helped this country navigate internal difference before. Now, look, none of this makes us uniquely enlightened, but it is a major part of the way in which the particularities and peculiarities of being Irish has helped us meet and metabolise uncertainty in the past. And so, what I wonder about now is whether these subtle tonal contractions across Irish society might precede more wider and less preventative rifts downstream, Not overnight, or in any dramatic or spectacular way, but gradually, sentence by sentence, conversation by conversation. When absolutes become easier to reach for, something really, really difficult to diagnose emerges in the atmosphere of the marketplace, lads. When certainty precedes curiosity, the space between people fucking narrows. Now that narrowing doesn't automatically lead to rupture. And Ireland still very much has a tendency to soften in that regard rather than splinter. But I just feel it's worth noticing, You know, I have no I have no grand ideas about where Ireland stands at this time, let alone where we may be headed. I'm an artist, like I paint pictures and I fucking write poems, you know. But I feel neither alarmed nor assured. What I do feel, though, is attentive, you know, attentive to my own language, attentive to that moment when a sentence could open a door or close one, attentive to whether I'm speaking from a grounded conviction or from a need to resolve discomfort too quickly. And you know, like, if indeed Ireland is currently navigating a threshold, as it may well might be, you know, it may well be that the container, let's say, that is best suited to this crossing is much more conversational in nature than it is political or ideological, you know. And if this is the case, then, you know, this threshold won't be crossed in the assembly rooms of Stormont or the corridors of Dáil Éireann, like, you know. And this is just it. It'll be crossed in the kitchens from Kerry to Donegal, and pubs from Antrim to Cork, in online common threads as well, like in podcast platforms, whether we like them or not. But more importantly, in the simple everyday encounters and exchanges of ordinary Irish life. Yeah. Icarus landing. Trying to stay landed in the body, lads. Just for today.